Let me start off this way. Free trade agreement itself, as we have now, the motive actually is to cut tariffs for some of the goods within the African continent itself. How do we stand to benefit? Looking at the fact that we have a major issue in our hands, talking about the issue of insecurity, which is very scary for some people doing business to even cross over down to Nigeria itself. Beyond just cutting tariffs, what are we expecting in the coming days with this signing itself?
All right, thank you. First is your question has lumped a lot of things together. I have to actually just take them out piecemeal. Let me park the issue of security for a while and just look at a free trade agreement or a free trade area. A free trade area is, by convention, a geographical space where all the national governments have come together and said to themselves, by signing a treaty, we are reducing or removing tariffs of trade, barriers to trade, protectionist barriers amongst ourselves so that we can trade better. Historically, Africa has not traded within itself. Just about 13% of the trade that goes in and out of Africa happens between African countries. What that says is that Nigeria trades more with China or trades more with the US than we trade with Ghana. So, with over 1 billion people on the continent, it will pay our industries in Nigeria and our economies in Africa if we traded with one another as African countries rather than traded with other people.
Now, let me bolt in here. Africa today is perhaps the poorest continent. Now, if we're going to trade within ourselves and when we are not ready to look, outside, don't you think what we're going to be redistributing perhaps might just be capital itself, might be poverty itself?
Okay. First is the fact that in that regard, the free trade agreement offers opportunities.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. Some of the protectionist barriers that exist when you're exporting to the EU now, or the US, or North America through NAFTA, will not exist in Africa. Meaning that I'll be able to make my adire in Nigeria, and my brother in Senegal will be able to appreciate it for what it is, rather than meet the stringent conditions, clothing conditions that they will ask me to do if I were exporting that particular fabric to the United States or the EU. So if those protectionist barriers are not there, Africans should be able to trade with each other.
Okay.
Now, the issue with that now is the concerns a lot of people have, which brings me back to your question, is what will Africans trade with? What will we trade amongst ourselves when we're not particularly productive? If you look at Nigeria now with a GDP that is heavily dependent on the price of crude oil, what will Nigeria produce? In paper, the CFTA looks very brilliant. I've got the document on my phone. I've read it over and over again. It is practically impossible to fault it from a policy point of view. But when you then look at it from an implementation point of view, there are so many potholes. There are so many protocols that they have not really fleshed out. They've actually given themselves 1 year to flesh it out. One of it is the most critical one for Nigeria is the protocol on point of origin. That is what qualifies a particular product as an African product. Because what you will see happening is that, let's just say China would open a factory in Benin Republic, and that factory will be more than the capacity of the Benin economy, meaning they're targeting Nigeria, which has 200 million people. They will manufacture whatever item it is to 80% or 90%, dump it in Benin Republic, couple it together and call it made in Benin Republic, and then ship it into Nigeria. Would you call that item made in Africa when it was actually part manufactured in and
I actually was looking at the issue of impediments here, beyond not being productive itself. I mentioned insecurity because no matter how productive you are, if you have your environment not suitable for people to actually come in to do business with you, how do you begin to strive? Okay. Because now when you talk about being productive, you create a lot of avenue to do that. Let's not also forget that going to the northern part of the country, perishable goods is something they actually delve into, and of course livestock. But when you have the spate of insecurity coming up, then how does the people within the African continent trust our working environment itself?
Okay, first is there are two things that are critical to the implementation of the AfCFTA. First is security, and I'll come back to that, and second is infrastructure. let me take security. You will realize that even our neighbors, Benin Republic, refused to assent to this bill until Nigeria assented. And the reason for this is not lost on those of us who study regional integration, because the GDP of the Benin Republic, 25% of it depends on trade with Nigeria. And trade with Nigeria is not in goods manufactured in the Republic to Benin. It's actually trade in goods that pass through Benin to arrive in Nigeria. Case in point is rice. Nigeria is striving to become sustaining in rice production. And we were praising the government because obviously from the port, from statistics at the port, rice importation had reduced. Only for Bloomberg to quickly put a needle in our bubble that, look, the rice you are not importing is going to Benin Republic. And we know that the people of Benin cannot consume this rice.
And so somehow it finds its way
back.
And
it's not a matter of somewhere. In broad daylight, trailers of rice queue up, come through our borders.
But of course, the federal government has denied it severally.
Yes, but we've been there and we've seen. Now, let me then talk about the issue of security. Starting from national security to border security will be tested here. Because first is you have to define what goods do you want and what goods you don't want. And if you've got a border security architecture that allows you to be able to filter not only goods now but services and even people that you don't want, it allows your national security architecture to say, okay, despite the ECOWAS protocol on free movement of persons, goods and services, despite the free trade agreement we signed over all over Africa, we will be able to deter threats to not only our economics but our polity. But if we don't have the security architecture, and I'm sorry to say this, Nigeria currently does not have the capacity to secure its borders, and I'm talking of more than 4,000 kilometers of borders, starting from our neighbors on the west, Benin.
But what happens to the joint task force set up, at the peak of the Boko Haram insurgency?
Let me link something to this, and it's one of the pitfalls that some of us are envisaging with the issue of free trade agreement, and that's geopolitical blocks. Africans have always banded together in a geopolitical array that just says, oh, we were colonized by the French. So because of that, we'll trade with ourselves. Welcome task force wasn't particularly effective for several reasons. The French would rather give intelligence on Boko Haram activities to Niger, even when the activities were happening within Nigeria. They will not share. I mean, remember that the multinational joint task force had issues even with being set up, who was going to head it, who was going to.
That.
Now, one of the things I have always talked about and I have written about is the fact that within Nigeria, Cameroon and Niger and Chad, we have created a large swath of land that is called an ungovernable territory, where even the multinational joint task force cannot manage. So you've got people who stay in there.
Is this where the insurgents operate from?
Yes, because we have so much land within those 4 areas, within those 4 countries, that if they attack Cameroon today and the Cameroonian forces repel them, they just move into Chad. If the Chadians then decide to fight them, they come back into Nigeria. So that in itself calls to question the effectiveness of the multinational joint task force.
Let me bring you to this. This was actually put together by BBC, and of course they were quoting African Development Bank in 2014, and they said only 16% of international trade by African countries take place between African countries, according to the research by the African Development Bank. So where are we heading? How do we explain all of this when we have just 16% of this international trade taking place between African countries itself?
Okay, that's exactly what the free trade agreement is supposed to tackle, to increase the capacity of African economies to trade with themselves, and thereby increase the capacity of the manufacturer, the producer, the service industry on the African continent, because you then have Africans trading with Africans. Now, my issue, and I've always said this, is it looks very beautiful on paper, but how do we implement? Let me give you an example. It is easier to find a shipping line to bring something from Guangzhou in China to Lagos, Nigeria, or Benin, Nigeria, than for you to find a shipping line that would take something from Lagos to Mombasa, to the port of Mombasa in Kenya. It just doesn't exist. So you find out that, and I said infrastructure and then security. Now, it doesn't exist. Shipping within African countries is usually point-to-point transit. A shipping line comes from China now, bringing everything that is coming to West Africa, including cars, and drops Sierra Leone, does Lome, and then does Togo, and finally they do Nigeria.
Yeah, but perhaps this, agreement signing it is rather too hasty, because you talked about the issue of, infrastructure. I think it was in year 2000. It was said that a contract was given, to have a road that will span across the African continent. Where that has headed now, no one knows. Now, we want to trade within ourselves and all that. Of course, we learned that there is this expressway that leads to Tunisia here in Nigeria and all of that. We'll get to hear all of these things. Are they real? You're not putting infrastructure in place. Now, I put it to you, for instance, you want to trade, an individual now wants to trade, with a counterpart in Benin Republic. He will rather look for the unconventional routes, as it were. There is no conventional routes where you can say, okay, I will pay duties and all that. Let me trade with my partner. With all of these things unresolved, is this thing not dead on arrival?
Okay. First is the fact that if we didn't sign this, there will be no roadmap to improve all of those things. Now, the fact that we have signed it...
aren't we thinking African here? You sign first before you put infrastructure in place. Would it have been the case in Europe?
The reason is, funny enough, the EU went through exactly the same path. Now, it's about vision. It's about a vision. You sign a document envisioning what you know would happen, what you want to happen. You then sit down with policymakers and people who can then articulate and then create a pathway towards that vision. And the reason is because if we all sat down without signing, an agreement that gives us a general direction, everybody will still keep doing. Let me give you an example. ECOWAS, which is, there are several economic and integration blocks all over Africa, but ECOWAS has been number one, and that's because it has tried to bring both Francophone and Anglophone Africans together and all of that. ECOWAS wants to have a single currency. In fact, last week it was just named, it's going to be the ECO. Now, it has serious challenges to surmount. The West African Francophone bloc have their own currency, the CFA. Nigeria, Naira, the Ghanaian cedi. But we're saying it would be easier if we could transact business within the 16 ECOWAS countries with the same currency. How are we going to do that? Okay, we'll try and sort out the monetary issues as we go on. But we have signed to say we're going to use the currency, the ECO. So that allows us to have a particular vision, and then we can sort out. Now, but let me come back to the issue of trade. In the past 10 years, Nigeria has promised to create a road that leads directly from Badagry in Lagos, from Mile 2 in Lagos, and lands in Abidjan, in Cote d'Ivoire. We called it the Lagos-Abidjan Corridor Road, which allows you to travel between Lagos and Cote d'Ivoire in one day.
And only the first phase has been approved.
And only the first phase has been done. In fact, that road is a pain in the neck of a lot of people who live in Lagos Island, who live in Lagos State, because that road has not been done. It means transacting business even between Cotonou and Lagos is traumatic.
That's exactly the point I'm making. And so we're signing a continental free trade agreement here. Now let's even come to, we are protectionists in Africa. You agree with me? Now we have ECOWAS protocol. Now we're not even talking of North African countries. And I tell you, Nigerians will rather first protect the interest of ECOWAS before protecting other. So these regional barriers, are we ready to shelve them? Are we ready to let go before we embrace the whole of the continent?
First, I think the regional barriers have to go. And I'll tell you why. most of the things we classify as regional integration bodies in Africa are actually byproducts of colonialism. And some of them that are not byproducts of colonialism are compromised and sub-optimized by colonialism. I'll give you an example, ECOWAS. There are several things that will happen in ECOWAS, and the French West Africans will have to check with France to see whether this is in the interest of France to cooperate with Nigeria, to cooperate with Ghana, to cooperate with Sierra Leone or Gambia. And if you look at that, a lot of things that we do within ECOWAS, we constantly have to squabble about why should this be here? Why should this not be here? Should France interfere in this? And the reason why we need to look Pan-African instead of being regional is because the kind of hold that the former colonial masters have on the economies of the French West African countries, one cannot imagine. Let me give you an example. When you print the currency of 11, 12 nations within a particular geography, you dictate to them a lot of economic policies. When you say to these countries, I subsidize your economy by 10, 15% annually, your budget. That's why you notice that immediately you're elected as head of government in most of these French West African countries. The first place they visit is Paris. To go and say to the French governor or the French prime minister.
Let me take you back to some of the things you said earlier. You said that even if you look at Lagos, for instance, there's no shipping line between Lagos and Mombasa, for instance. And of course, when you look at all of this impediment put on one side, what happens to the issue of sovereignty here? You're talking about economic policies within the West African region now. And now the issue of sovereignty too is there, because they have to protect their own territorial integrity, as the case is. But that line of we not having a shipping line, for instance, to actually transport most of our goods, how do we start from there? Okay. How can we build on that?
No, that is an area of opportunity. Because I recall Nigeria did not only have a national shipping line, which helped us to trade better. A lot of African countries had shipping lines. But over time, as we stopped to transact business with each other and relied more on Europe, America, and subsequently China, we stopped to create shipping lines and routes that allowed us to trade with each other. And you will notice historically that Africans really traded with each other, because if you remember these trans-Saharan trade routes, where you could move from Borno in Nigeria and be in Mali and trade whatever you wanted to. But now what we need to do currently is to create not only the infrastructure, but to create a funding and financing model that allows investors to invest in transportation within Africa.
What would the process look like? Because let's also look at our infrastructure deficit itself. Looking at railway, for instance, we do not have, even though we have some archaic railway system. So how does the process start off?
Okay.
When you don't have all of this in place?
What would happen on the long run is that each nation would weigh its own economies of scale and its comparative advantage. The port in Cotonou now has gotten a loan. The Port Authority in Cotonou has gotten a loan from the African Development Bank to expand its operations and then do, concessional railway right from the port to countries up in the north who are landlocked, like Niger. The port of Cotonou now has decided, look, the capacity we have is beyond our own nation. If anything is coming to Niger, why don't you give it to us? It will be goods in transit. We will just take it from the port, put it on a railway system, boom, it's in Niamey. Now, those are the kinds of opportunities that I expect Nigerian policymakers to start to think about. Let me give you an example. Russia is not part of the EU, but it supplies a few EU members aside the Eastern Bloc of Europe. It supplies gas. Russia builds the infrastructure, even working through little countries like Georgia, like Latvia, to enable them reach Western Europe with their gas. Nigeria has exactly the same opportunity that Russia has. We can supply the whole of West Africa with gas. But how do we do that? We have to build infrastructure and say to Ghana, look, I'll give you gas, but my gas pipelines must pass through Ghana. We'll give Benin Republic gas, and then get a pricing regime that reflects the fact that this is cooperative. We're trading together. So all of that, that's why I keep saying that the policymakers, the bureaucrats now have to sit down. It's one thing for the prime ministers and the heads of governments to sign an agreement. Now, the policymakers have to sit down. Just like you said, we cannot continue to be protectionist, because if you look at it now, there is actually nothing to be protectionist about. If we look in our homes, in our offices, almost everything is Chinese.
Don't we have enough paperwork done in terms of even policies? Doesn't government have good policies on paper? And the implementation has always been the problem over the years. Like, it's not about the money now, because I know, for instance, the government has always got out to borrow. And now, what is really our problem? How can we get it right?
Okay, Nigeria has a litany of issues, definitely. But I think one of the things that we need to look at in this particular free trade agreement is to look at the opportunity it offers for small-scale enterprises. To say, I make very good shirts, African shirts, and they're in Nigeria. With the use of the internet, people can buy across Africa, and I can be able to ship them. They can ship them. I can send them to anywhere. Because currently, what we're doing is we're asking ourselves not to trade with Africa, but we're opening ourselves up to trade with other parts of the country.
Let me even ask this question. What influence do you think the United States and China will have on this free trade agreement?
Okay. One of the things we have done is to simulate what the response of China specifically would be to this. And it was one of the things I mentioned earlier, that one of the things China will try to do now is to bring more factories. Instead of manufacturing in China, they bring it here and say, okay, we still are going to bring this to Africa, but we'll then manufacture it there, which will grow the manufacturing sector. It will also translate into jobs.
Okay, because we just have to let you go. But really, some of your parting word here, how can you have mentioned quite a number of impediments that could walk away against this particular free trade agreement itself. But what does the government need to do at this point in time, given the fact that they've signed it already?
Beautiful. First is the fact that Nigeria must create a strategy for this. And I haven't seen that strategy. And the reason why this strategy is important and imperative now is because, if you remember, Morocco wanted to join the ECOWAS. They applied to join ECOWAS, and that's Morocco that is, up there. Now, but immediately they realized that we're going to have this free trade agreement, they withdrew, and okay, so we're going to join the agreement and we'll be able to trade Pan-Africa.
Well, we must say
so
big
much
thank you,
to
Mr.
Ademola Adewusi. He is a public affairs, a public policy analyst, and we've been looking at the AfCFTA signing. We must say thank you so much for being here. You just have to go to our Lagos studio right away, because you're standing by to keep us up to speed with what is happening in the national dailies. We'll be right back in Ibadan.